All right, I'm going to ask if everybody who's interested in staying can take their seats. We'll be starting very shortly. So, good morning, everybody, and welcome. My name is Zinta Zummers, and I'm the climate lead for the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, and I'm also the co-chair of the climate subgroup of the IASC, which is the group that coordinates humanitarian actors and action more broadly. And as you can see, after only 2 days of climate talks, I've already lost my voice. So fortunately, I'm going to be short, and I'm here to mainly introduce the fantastic speakers before us today and give you an outline of the run of show. So as we all know, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, in their synthesis report, which was released in March, noted that climate change is currently causing widespread impacts and losses and damages to nature and society, and that this is unequally distributed around the world. Now, as humanitarian actors and the humanitarian system, we well know this because we're dealing with these impacts every day. And we're very concerned about these growing trends. And we're here to explore learning, insights, and action related to climate-related losses and damages. So how will we do this today? Well, first, my colleague Mary Friel from the IFRC will make a presentation on the roles and limits of humanitarian action. And then we will have a fireside chat with a variety of humanitarian actors sharing experiences from the ground. And this will be moderated by Kirsten Hagen, who is the co-chair of the IASC group with me. And finally, we very much look forward to hearing from party stakeholders on their perspectives and views of what we might look forward to from the Glasgow Dialogue and upcoming UNFCCC negotiations. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for joining, and I'll hand it over to Mary.
So thanks very much, Zinta, for the introduction. I'm Mary Friel. I'm the Senior Climate Officer at the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent National Societies. And to kick things off, we're going to share a brief presentation on aspects of humanitarian action relevant to the loss and damage conversation. And in sharing our role, we are incredibly mindful of the limits of our action. We do not respond to the full range of losses and damages experienced by countries, communities, and people. And what is clear is a full, comprehensive approach to loss and damage is needed. And to help unpack this, we're going to run through a couple of different tools, one being from the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance, which put forward a framework on responding to loss and damage, on how to close the gaps in averting, minimising and addressing. And also, I suppose, to go through and offer some perspectives on what we can do and what action. We'll hear that in the fireside chat. But in offering a humanitarian perspective, we really want to emphasise that humanitarian action and actors are not one thing. It's a wide range of organisations and actors from international, nationally rooted organisations, local grassroots actors and volunteers as well, with communities always being the first to respond when a crisis strikes. So in all of this, when we talk about humanitarian response, we're also mindful that it is the state that has both the responsibility for and the primary role in initiating, coordinating and implementing humanitarian assistance to people impacted by disaster. So a little bit of context on humanitarian action, our roles and limits. If we move to the next slide. So why are we here? Zinta put it so eloquently. What is clear is the impacts are rising. We are confronting rising losses and damages. We are seeing that. As humanitarians, we cannot stress the urgency highly enough. We are seeing intensified heat waves, cyclones, flooding. We are seeing the impacts already very starkly at 1.1 degree global warming. And what's clear is we need to see responses which bridge humanitarian, climate and development gaps. This is just the tip of the iceberg and does not reflect the full range of very localised crises which are experienced by communities and people across the world. And already we're sitting at 3.3 to 3.6 billion people living in contexts highly vulnerable to climate change. So we're really here to stress that urgency of action and to bring that experience, which we hope is relevant to this discussion. Next slide. So in engaging in this discussion, we're very keen to clarify our roles. Firstly, we seek to minimise loss of life, loss of income, loss of livelihoods, loss of health through taking effective disaster preparedness measures, pursuing anticipatory action, and scaling up early warning, early action. And when a disaster strikes, we respond to the impacts to meet the immediate needs of people. And this includes as well in the early recovery phase as well, and provision of shelter, healthcare, including mental health support, support as well in terms of loss of income assistance, access to water, sanitation, and support to people who are particularly impacted, including people who are displaced. And we often focus as well on cash first approaches as well to reach people directly impacted. This slide should also be helpful in illustrating what's missing as well. This is how we respond, and it's, I suppose, a small element of the overall loss and damage landscape. We are not responding when it comes to cultural loss, loss of infrastructure, large-scale economic losses and impacts, which are very much important and part of the loss and damage conversation. We are focused on people, impacts at a community level, and focused on the most vulnerable. In terms of our mandate, our actions are based on the humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. And we're very much guided by this. We are guided our actions in terms of responding to where there's the greatest vulnerability, where there's the greatest needs, irrespective of what has caused that crisis, whether it be climate-related or others. On capacity and systems, in terms of limits, we are very much operating in a system which is overstretched, and also responding to multiple and overlapping crises as well, and other compounding risks from the climate crisis, including fragility, conflict, and economic shocks. On duration, actors are present in terms of preparedness, anticipatory action, and resilience building ahead of crisis to try and minimise losses and damages. But the other context, I suppose, to highlight is we are there as well in terms of longer term in the context of fragility and conflict, and also for humanitarian actors such as IFRC that work across the humanitarian and development nexus. We're also looking at bridging some of the gaps between short-term and long-term support and action. If we move to the next slide. What we really think is helpful in unpacking some of the policy decisions, actions and choices when it comes to loss and damage is thinking about the scale of impacts and action which are required across the avert, minimise and address spectrum, and really putting people and communities at the heart of that. We want to be clear as humanitarians, we do not want to be responding. We want to see as much upstream action as possible in order to prevent human suffering and to be able to address the impacts at the earliest possible stage. And so we want to see action to close the emissions gap, to lessen the climate impacts on people and on the planet, and critically that leaves the most adaptation options available to reduce further losses and damages. In this discussion, we don't want adaptation to be neglected. We need support for people and communities to prepare, to reduce risks and withstand climate impacts. And yet we know the climate adaptation gap is wide and present, with funding 5 to 10 times below what is currently needed. And again, for many actors who are working across the humanitarian development nexus, we really want to emphasise that resilience, building of communities, and investing in community-led adaptation is really, really critical and part of the upstream investment that needs to happen. We also want to highlight the preparedness or protection gap, as it's named here, which are some of the actions in which we can reduce losses and damages ahead of time through shock-responsive social protection systems, disaster risk financing, early warning, early action, and preparedness assistance are all areas in which it can contribute to action before a crisis strikes. And these are areas which we know are not fully harnessed and should be explored as part of this conversation. On response, humanitarian actors are responding when crisis strikes. We have the response mechanisms and capability to do that, but we want to be clear that as much upstream action as possible is what is required, and that we are only one slim part of what's required in terms of full comprehensive response to loss and damage. So if we move to the final slide, we want to offer a number of basic principles or approaches which the humanitarian sector feel are relevant in this loss and damage conversation. First is humanity, and really putting people and their experience, their dignity and agency at the heart of choices and decisions, and to make sure that it's not actions being done onto people, but that our people are deciding their own priorities, actions, and are actively part of putting forward solutions. Additionality, again, what is clear is that there is further action needed upstream and mitigation. We need more finance for adaptation, but we also need to see new, additional and predictable finance for loss and damage. We also want to highlight the principle of leave no one behind, which is really at the core of humanitarian action, and really to prioritise those who are being left behind at the forefront of thinking about our responses. So not at the end, but at the start, thinking about those who are most excluded, most marginalised, and ensuring that approaches really put their participation at the very heart of some of the solutions. Localisation, so again, thinking about where we can embed locally led approaches to loss and damage throughout this conversation is key. On urgency, there's much that we can share in terms of transferable learning on mechanisms and modalities. We know what works in terms of getting cash assistance to communities and to people when crisis strikes, and ahead of crisis as well, and anticipate a reaction. So being able to share some of that transferable learning in this discussion is something that we are keen to do, and also to ensure that that principle of urgency is brought in to loss and damage finance as well. On a balanced approach, again, we want to emphasise that a comprehensive approach is needed to respond to the full range of losses and damages, and this requires many different actors, many different sectors, and these are some of the elements that we really want to emphasise as we move forward. We are happy to play our part to engage in these discussions, but this is a much broader conversation, and we look forward to sharing some of the direct experience from colleagues. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mary. Is this working? Can you hear me?
Yeah, not so sure. There we go. Brilliant. Hi, everyone. As Zinta flagged before, my name's Kirsten Hagen. I'm from the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, and together with Zinta from OCHA, we co-chair the working group on climate change that is part of the Global Humanitarian Coordination Architecture. And one thing that has been fantastic from my perspective, having been trying to coordinate this group since 2019, is the massive increase in interest and concern from the humanitarian community in the humanitarian impacts of the climate crisis, as you can see by the panel here today of humanitarians from around the world, both in present and online. Just a couple of points before we begin. I wanted to flag that we have a very kind colleague up the back who is translating into Spanish for a number of Spanish speakers, so please do forgive that there'll be a little bit of extra noise in that corner, so that's the reason for that. The second thing to just flag is those that are watching online, a big welcome. You can put questions into the chat, and then when we get to the Q&A session, we'll be able to answer those. So I wanted to introduce some of the fantastic people that we have with us today, both online and in person. First of all, we have Ms. Serene Phillip, if you want to wave at people, from WFP. She's WFP's technical lead on social protection, based in Mogadishu in Somalia. And Somalia, as many of you would be aware, has been facing a successive cycle of droughts, of ongoing climatic shocks, including, I think, 5 failed rainy seasons, and then now they're facing floods. We also have from MSF online, Dr. Jacob Makareri, who is the medical coordinator for MSF based in Chad, in N'Djamena. And as many of you would be aware, Chad is a long-standing humanitarian context where around 40% of the population are in need of humanitarian assistance based on the UN appeal, but only 11% of that humanitarian appeal is funded. So just when Mary was flagging that the humanitarian community doesn't have the capacity to manage all of the impacts of climate shocks, there's one very clear example of an only 11% funded appeal. And as many of you would be aware, Chad is also marked as one of the most highly vulnerable countries looking at the ND Gain Index because of both its vulnerabilities and lack of resilience building there, and also as well as the specific succession of climate shocks. We also have from MSF in the room, in order to complement what will be said online, Dr. Maria Guevara, who's the International Medical Secretary of MSF and has worked with MSF for over 20 years in a number of contexts, including some of the ones that we'll be discussing today. We also have online Ms. Priska Chisala, who's the Director of Programs for the Malawi Red Cross Society. So this is a national organization, and she's there been running their programs looking at climate preparedness, adaptation, early warning systems, and response. And then finally, we have Barbara Rosen Jacobson, who's from Mercy Corps. If you want to wave, Barbara, many of you will have seen her in the previous panel. She's clearly in hot demand. And she's just recently published with a number of partners a report looking at lessons learned from the humanitarian community that might be relevant for the loss and damage conversations. So really excited to have this panel with us. And thank you so much for joining, both people online and in person. So I'm going to start, if I can, with Serene, if that's all right. And I just wanted to ask you, based on your experiences in Somalia, what's been the impact of the recurrent droughts in Somalia, and how have some of your work, including anticipatory action, helped to reduce the impact of the drought on people's food security?
Thank you so much. Greetings to everyone from WFP Somalia. So thank you for the question. And to start with, I'd like to take you mentally into WFP work in Somalia. To begin with, just to give you a perspective, the total population of Somalia is close to 17 million. Of that, 70% live below the poverty line. 90% of those experience multi-dimensional poverty. So that's a bit about the background. And for all the recurrent shocks that were mentioned, WFP is responding in a number of ways. 6.6 million people are in dire food insecurity at the moment. 1.6 million people are displaced. Of that, 219,000 are currently displaced because of drought. So you see the impact has been compounded by one shock after another. How does WFP respond to that? So for us, we have built on the national safety nets, that's the social protection platforms, through anticipatory action. So it's not just about a one-off intervention, but building on the systems that are already in place. So through the anticipatory action, we were able to test the systems way back in 2020 for the efficiency and the ability to respond through SURF funding. Then subsequently, we were able to scale it up with additional funding from ECHO, FCDO, our traditional humanitarian donors, to test again the national system. So we're actually layering and building on something that exists. In the recent past, as in last year in 2022, for Somalia, had the largest anticipatory action, that's AA investment, close to 6.7 million to around 90,000 individuals. So that's the kind of investment that we could bring in to take the investment to scale. So that's a bit about what we're doing in Somalia. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And I'm hearing a lot about this compounding, overlapping shocks and how they're undermining people's resilience and risks. And I think we need to come back to you to dig a little bit more into some of the challenges around response, which you started to allude to, but we're going to come back on that. I now want to turn to our colleague online, Dr. Jacob Makareri. Are you there? Have we got Dr. Jacob? No?
Yes,
we do. Excellent. Great to have you online. So, Dr. Jacob, I wanted to ask you, as a medical humanitarian organization and working in one of the most climate vulnerable countries, what impacts is MSF witnessing, and are you as an individual witnessing in this context where you work, and how are you responding? Over to you.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. Distinguished delegate and participant. As already said, I'm Dr. Jacob Maikere, medical coordinator of MSF. As you are aware, Chad is facing multiple challenges whose risk and scale have been increased by unmitigated climate change. Through health and humanitarian system, we attempt to adapt, but there are limits to what both health and humanitarian system can manage. We are witnessing loss and damages related to climate change in the form of increased risk of communicable disease and ill health, forced migration displacement, reduced quantity, quality, and diversity of food, and importantly, water scarcity. Right now in the country, we are 4 section of MSF, and all of us dealing with the impact of climate change. Loss and damage is difficult to measure, but we consider these to be non-economic losses and damages induced by climate change. These must be accounted for and factored into global response mechanism. Being in charge, to answer your question, we witness, first of all, hotter temperature and unpredictable precipitation impact harvest, water, and nutrition and food security. MSF is witnessing earlier and longer peak season, that is yearly period with increased incidence of acute malnutrition. In Chad, we are having to scale up nutrition project to respond to the surge in need over longer periods for malnutrition crisis which have become chronic. I will tell you that from 2011 to 2019, MSF ran an emergency response to acute malnutrition emergency in Hajar Lamis province, handing over to local health authorities and partner when things stabilize. But 10 years later, in 2021, our team witnesses in the impact of scarce rainfall and poor harvests in the same area and launched again an emergency nutrition response following renewed high rates of severe acute malnutrition. The malnutrition crises have become chronic, and in 2022, the Chadian government announced a malnutrition emergency that is still in place today. In 2022, we treated 26,214 children between age of 6 months and 5 years in our ambulatory feeding center. This figure masks the number of children who are readmitted due to lack of nutritious food available after discharge. In many of the places where we work, the most vulnerable and affected community are those who live according to season, like agro-pastoralists, whose livelihood, health, and well-being depend on their ability to monitor and move with the season. In April this year, we already began to see an increase in the percentage of children with severe malnutrition, indicating the beginning of the lean season, usually meant to start in June. Secondly, Chad experiences flood every year, but the 2022 brought some of the worst flood we have seen in 30 years. It led to large-scale displacement and immense needs that outweighed the response capacity in a country that continued to be almost invisible in terms of international attention. MSF team provided help for those displaced as population were cut off from medical services during the flooding. However, the flood also resulted in destruction of 460,000 hectares of land, killed 19,000 cattle, and affecting nearly 1 million people across the country, according to the health authorities, with consequences for food and nutrition security and potential for disease outbreak. And finally, to finish, climate change is impacting the livelihood and cultural heritage of Chadians, especially pastoralists, who are forced to change their migratory route in search of pastures for livestock. Water scarcity impact conflicts over resources as more people move to the south of the country, where most of the water resources are. That is what is happening now in Chad. Thank you for giving me the opportunity again and for your attention.
Shukran Katir, Dr. Jacob. That was very powerful, and I think a really clear message there in terms of repeating, overlapping shocks of the droughts impacting the same communities and then communities being impacted by floods, and not only the impacts of the floods immediately in terms of death and destruction, but longer term impacts on food security, health, even access to health services. So thank you so much for that. I now want to turn to our colleague based in Malawi, Ms. Priska Chisala. Are you there on the line, Priska? Have we got Priska online?
Yes, I'm right here.
I can hear you. Brilliant.
Yes, I'm here. Yeah.
So Priska, we've just heard from our colleagues in Chad about repeated overlapping shocks there, in particular droughts and floods. And I know in Malawi you've experienced repeated cyclones in particular. I'd be really interested, as you've been experiencing more frequent and intense cyclones and flooding connected to climate change, what are the losses and damages you're seeing, in particular from the recent cyclone Freddie? And what are some of the solutions? How are you responding, and how is the National Society in Malawi responding to these?
Thank you very much, Kristen, for giving me an opportunity to also share the Malawi experiences around how we are being affected by effects of climate change. I think just as our colleagues in Chad, Malawi is not spared from the effects of climate change year in, year out, where we have been experiencing a number of tropical cyclones. I'll be talking of like the year 2021, 2022, where we were also affected by TC Anna, TC Gombe, and this year we were also affected by tropical cyclone Freddie, which was a very devastating situation, and the disaster was complex in nature in that it came in at a time when the country was also battling with the worst cholera outbreak in the history of Malawi, where each and every district was already affected with the cholera outbreak. But also it came at a time when we already had several families having food insecurity issues. So it really made the disaster itself very complex. And because of the complex scenario that we were in, where we were looking at the populations being hit as those that were already like suffering from cholera, these were the communities that we had already, that had not yet recovered from the past effects, from the effects of the past tropical cyclones. So it had a very significant impact in terms of human and social development effects. For example, we'll be talking of loss of lives, where we saw over 600 people dying and over 500 were lost. We saw people being displaced, having nowhere to stay, where we had about 659,000 people having nowhere to stay. They were living in camps. They were living in places which were to serve as educational places, in a way disrupting also educational activities. But also, like I said, it came in at a time when we already had we were already battling with cholera countrywide, meaning to say that even the health systems had already been disrupted at that particular moment. So just worsening the situation in as far as access to health services is concerned for vulnerable populations. And again, there was a diminishment in terms of livelihoods for the people that were affected. So the impact was just so huge. I mean, from social impact, looking at economical impact, the well-being of the people being affected, the livelihoods and all that. And as a national society, we have been working to just support the populations that were affected. But I think what I would want to mention here is that we have learned that having been exposed to the impacts of climate change, I think one of the interventions that we've seen as at least contributing positively in as far as minimizing loss and damage is the implementation of early warning, early actions. Actually, we would want to share here that although we are talking of, for example, over 600 deaths in Malawi, we feel as a national society, because before the disaster came in, we were already working with the populations, at least where we were providing the early warning messages to the people. So we supported with anticipatory actions, just to make sure that at least we anticipate the disaster itself, and also we have early actions to the early warning messages that we were getting from the Department of Climate Change and Meteorological Services, meaning to say that by the time we were receiving these floods, at least we had helped most populations to move from the risk areas to safer places. So again, we minimized loss in terms of lives, but also the properties that the affected populations had. It's just that the disaster the magnitude was just so huge. And again, another area that we have learned is, yes, we were able to respond in several areas or districts, but we have noted a difference in terms of the level of response amongst the affected populations, where in the areas where we are already working with the people on anticipatory actions and DRR activities, the reception to the advisories was so positive that many utilized the information as compared to those that were not yet exposed to such kind of messaging, meaning to say that we need to invest more in anticipatory actions, in DRR actions, in preparedness activities, as opposed to response and recovery interventions, as far as our wishes to address or to minimize the loss and damage. I would want to end there for now. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Priska. So I think some clear common messages here around the challenge of overlapping shocks, not just climate related, because Priska mentioned cholera as well, but also some commonalities in terms of the action and the response that's being provided by humanitarian organizations, be that health and care, be that early warnings and anticipatory action, be that supporting people to move either before or after a disaster hits, provision with food security, with shelter, particularly for those displaced, and interesting some of the side impacts around impacts on education. So when people are displaced, they're often moved into educational centres, into schools, and that also disrupts schooling. I'd like to now turn to Barbara and to maybe zoom out a little bit. So we've given some details here of humanitarian action to deal with some of the current impacts of the climate crisis. And these have come 3 specific examples from the Africa region. It would be great to hear from you, Barbara, a little bit more of a global view of what's been happening across the world and in different regions, and what the learning is from humanitarian organizations around the action that works, what some of the gaps are and some of the challenges. Over to you.
Great, thank you, Kirsten. And indeed, you referred to it in the beginning already. We recently published, as part of the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance, a thought piece on lessons from the humanitarian sector that could be relevant for the topic of loss and damage. And let's be clear, we humanitarians don't have all the answers. And loss and damage can certainly not be fixed by humanitarian action alone. We're also still learning. But as we've heard from especially from my fellow panelists, humanitarian action is an integral part of loss and damage in anticipating and responding to the immediate needs of people affected by disasters. And these disasters indeed can be overlapping, and they are increasing in intensity. And so while this kind of nexus between humanitarian action and climate is very evident for the communities that are experiencing disasters, it's not always mirrored by policy domains, which tend to remain rather siloed between humanitarian action, peace, development, climate. So what we did with the Zurich Alliance, we started to collect inputs, lessons learned, challenges from humanitarian professionals around the world from different kind of organizations that could be relevant in the context of loss and damage. And I'd like just to highlight 4 key points that came out, and they relate also to the previous interventions that we've heard. So the first is that humanitarian action can deploy funds very quickly. For example, compared to the GCF, which often takes several years from a kind of project development until disbursement, as you probably all know. 60% of humanitarian funding is committed within 2 months after a weather-related disaster. So that's very fast in comparison. And one of the ways in which this can be done so quickly is by pooling funds in so-called pooled funds. And they can be flexibly implemented to provide the right kind of support in a certain context. I think most of you might know the SURF, which is often referenced in climate negotiations as a good practice, but there are also many country-based pooled funds or rapid response mechanisms that operate after being triggered or following a certain decision tree. So there are many examples of how this can be deployed quickly. The second thing I'd like to highlight is that funding is increasingly multi-sectoral, which is important to make sure that it can provide the right kind of support needed in a community and that corresponds to their actual needs. And we want to avoid, for example, that an intervention focuses on access to water while what is actually needed is access to food. Third, and this is related to the previous point, it's very important that funding prioritizes the involvement from the outset of the communities that are affected. To co-design and implement the assistance and focus on equity so that assistance does not fall victim to the power dynamics of the humanitarian sector or any kind of development or internationally funded intervention. And let's not forget, local populations are there from the outset and are best aware of how to respond and what the needs are. And finally, and this is again related to the previous point, humanitarian assistance takes more and more the form of cash instead of in-kind distributions. Cash can be deployed more quickly, has co-benefits for the local economy, and most importantly, it empowers households and communities, provides them with the dignity to spend it what they need rather than assuming from an external viewpoint what is needed. So these are just 4 quick lessons from the humanitarian sector. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Barbara. And I think she follows up well this point around humanitarian funding being fairly fast. Some of the examples that were given by Serene and by Priska in terms of anticipatory action, and it's because of all the investment in advance that it's actually possible to disperse funds sometimes just on the basis of a forecast before the event has even happened. I now want to try and do a quick round, and we have a few other people in the room that we're hoping to hear from, including the audience. So I'm hoping you're preparing your questions or comments. But I do want to come back to a couple of the challenges that you raised and to maybe dig into some of the examples and the lessons learned that Barbara raised. So I wanted to come back to you, Serene, and just wonder specifically, given you're focusing and working in a country that is conflict affected, and that obviously creates specific challenges for implementation. And it would be really interesting to hear from you, what are those challenges that you think will arise when trying to implement action to address losses and damages? Over to you.
Thank you so much for that question. And once again, I would like to take you back to Somalia mentally and picture the key challenges that we spoke about in the first session, that the populations are impacted by multiple recurrent shocks. Now, when these shocks hit, quite often we are aware that they're coming. We know that there's drought. We know that there's going to be a flood that's coming in. So I think it would be quite critical to be prepared. There are multiple ways in addressing these challenges. However, I would like to focus on two aspects. One, I had alluded to the social protection systems, that is national systems, building on government-established systems. Even if it is a fragile context, we need to build on the government, the duty bearer, and the citizen relationship. So system building becomes extremely important. For WFP, we're implementing the national safety nets on behalf of the government, that is the Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs. So that's the investment in systems building. We're also working with the Somalia Disaster Management Agency, SODMA in short. With the agency, which sits right under the President's office, has the mandate to coordinate across ministries, and this becomes quite key in multi-ministry action and coordination. So that becomes an important platform for building the national capabilities. Currently, we are talking about floods, the triggers, and putting government before non-state actors, droughts, as well as other national capacities of government. The other thing that becomes quite key in national response is financing. So prior, like I mentioned, that we are aware of the disasters to happen. Pre-financing becomes extremely important so that systems are able to respond in time, because we need to remember when we talk about loss and damage, we can replace assets, but we cannot replace life that has been lost. So those are some of the key things. The other important aspect would be that if timely response has been undertaken, people are not displaced, and especially the most vulnerable segments, that is women and children, are protected from unnecessary harm that comes along with it. So I think that's...
Thanks so much, Serene. And I think some really good points that hadn't been flagged before in terms of the importance of coordination with the government and humanitarian organizations, the importance of coordination between different ministries of the government, and also the importance of investing in capacities. So thanks so much for that. I now wanted to move actually to Dr. Maria Guevara from MSF, who's sitting here on the panel today. And just to ask you again, taking a little bit of a step back, knowing that you're very familiar with the situation in Chad, but also globally, given the increasingly chronic nature of different humanitarian needs in many contexts, what are you seeing as some of the main challenges or gaps when it comes to implementing action to address loss and damage? And will be potential challenges coming up ahead with the fund? And do you have any recommendations to address these?
Big questions. Thank you, Kirsten, and every one of you to be here with us, to listen to our plights and calls for action. I'm always incredibly impressed on how creative our human minds are to coming up with new terms of what we call emergency, of old concepts. But yet we are struggling with finding the solutions and taking action even when the fire is lit under us, as is the case today. So for me, loss and damage, or for us at MSF and all medical humanitarian actors, it's not either the little L&D or the big L&D, it's all emergencies. And maybe the first gap is really realizing, as Mary has said, the urgency behind this. And I think for a medical, as a doctor and a medical humanitarian actor, it means act now. I mean, speed is of the essence, and we've spoken about fast, and that is what we need to do. But there are lessons learned, and there are the basics to life support, and we call it, at least in my lingo and as a doctor, CPR. It's cardiopulmonary resuscitation. I have to say that we do need a bit of airway support and a bit of chest compressions, considering what we've just heard about the reality on the field. There is really not much time to waste. The people and the communities most vulnerable are being affected today. They need protection and they need resuscitation. Unfortunately, as we've heard, the current responses are inadequate. So if I'm going to focus on anything, and at the risk of just repeating myself and everyone else, I think it bears repeating in any case. So I'm using CPR, mnemonic. C is actually the first challenge for coherence and coordination, and often there is a lack of that. There are, when we're thinking of compounding emergencies, we probably need to change a mindset on compounding solutions. And there are missed opportunities to minimize loss and damage, and that's in ensuring coherence across the sectors, whether that's humanitarian health, disaster risk reduction, or even this up-and-coming loss and damage response mechanisms that are in front of us, and in sharing those tools and the principles behind the needed actions. When it comes to the local and national level adaptation efforts and the response to loss and damages, as we've heard from our colleagues, Chad also has national determined contributions and national adaptation plans, but they're not connecting to the health and humanitarian actors. We need to work together on this, and this crossover linkages and cross-fertilization must happen at the field level, and we need to be open to that collectively. P is for people. We've already heard the importance of bringing in the community, but it's also important to highlight what we need to understand about those needs and impacts. And if the Santiago Network and L&D Fund needs to be put in place, it needs to be functionally looking at the technical support to quantify the non-economic losses and slow onset losses, such as the ones we've shared already today, including the health. And finally, on the R, it's about resources, and greater investment really needs to be put in place, including the health adaptations and as much as the response. In where MSF works, in over 60% of locations are in conflict settings, so we've already heard that those make up a majority of what's most vulnerable today and unable to meet. We have lessons learned on working in such complex situations. But any response and efforts need to be explicit and new channels of support and funding to make proper effective response. We have lessons learned. There are shortfalls on those, but we need to learn from those mistakes and learn from those experiences and not make the same mistakes. So new actions must work hand in hand and in complementarity with existing response efforts. Thanks.
Thank you so much, and I'm going to remember that CPR of coherence, people, and resources. I now want to turn to Priska, and maybe going back slightly to what Serene was talking about in terms of national coordination and national frameworks. It would be good to understand from Malawi what national frameworks are playing a role in responding to losses and damages, and how can local actors, so local organizations, local government, help to scale up action to better reduce and respond to loss and damage. Over to you, Priska.
Thank you so much, Christine. I would really want to join the previous speakers around emphasizing the need for coordinated efforts in as far as aiming at reducing loss and damage is concerned. So I will give a practical example of how we are working with the government as Malawi Red Cross Society. So basically in our auxiliary role to public authorities, in whatever in terms of our interventions around disaster risk reduction, anticipatory actions, we do it jointly with the government. So we look at what are the existing policies at national level. So we'll be talking over, for example, the National Resilience Strategy, which emphasizes the need for more anticipatory early actions as a way of minimizing loss and damage. So in other words, what would also be encouraging going forward is the fact that we need to just work together, like all actors accepting the fact that for example, the Department of Disaster Management in Malawi is the main coordinating body in as far as disaster risk management issues are concerned. Why am I saying this? I'm also looking at, for example, when we are faced with disasters, you see many actors going on the ground to respond, going in different directions. But what we have noted is most actors will go to easy to reach areas, so leaving behind the hard to reach areas. And as a national society, because we work hand in hand with the government authorities in as far as, getting guidance on where are the needs, which sectors have not been reached, what are the hard to reach areas. This has helped us to at least reach the hard to reach populations, the most vulnerable and therefore making the interventions in terms of DRR anticipated actions, even response activities, to be relevant. So in order for us to minimize duplication of efforts, to maximize the limited resources, because everyone else is scrambling for the same resources, so we need to look at a coordinated way of approaching DRR interventions or minimizing the loss and damage. Therefore, we need to recognize the already existing structures in place and just work towards the same, because even in terms of the capacities, we have different humanitarian actors with different expertise. For example, us as Malawi Red Cross, we are very good at shelter. And then we'll have, for example, Save the Children, which is very good in education. So if we work together, it means we'll have a comprehensive, a well-coordinated kind of approach with having the government put structures in the lead of whatever interventions we are doing. And one area that I also believe needs to be looked into in as far as the gaps in investing issues around loss and damage is the fact that I have noted that many partners or many donors are interested in investing more in terms of response and recovery interventions, as opposed to anticipatory actions or DRR interventions, which, I mean, at least easier or cheaper as compared to response and recovery interventions. So I think there's also need to localize our adaptation and DRI interventions to better support preparedness. So there's need to invest more in community and locally led anticipatory actions and DRR as opposed to response and recovery in order to build resilient communities, because disasters will always be there. But we need to look at how do we build resilient communities in the face of the various disasters that we are facing. And I mean, going forward, I think it's also important that reflections have to be done after a disaster. So post-disaster assessments would also have to be very key in as far as improving the local level, local actions, interventions around reducing and responding to loss and damage. So again, when we are responding, I have also noted that some areas are also left out. For example, we'll talk of mental health issues. These are issues that will be there, but when we are responding, they are usually left out. So after a disaster has happened, we need to have a comprehensive, holistic approach to the additional needs that need to be focused on in terms of recovery as well as further early preparedness interventions.
Thank you so much, Priska. So really clear in terms of the need for government leadership, coordinating with the government, using the existing government structures, but recognizing the critical role of local organizations in reaching those that are hard to reach and may well get left behind, as well as the need to invest in what's actually cheaper in terms of preventing so that there is less of a massive need to respond. So thank you so much for that. Barbara, and forgive me, we're running a little short on time, so I'm going to ask you to be brief because we do want to hand over to other colleagues as well. But based on this and on your research, do you have any specific recommendations as colleagues in the room and a number that are also at the moment discussing the Santiago network consider how they're going to design and set up this loss and damage fund?
Yes, I do. And I think we are very coordinated as a panel in emphasizing coordination. I wanted to close indeed with emphasizing the need for three things: flexibility, coordination, and combating silos. Funding is often most efficient and effective when it is adaptable to what communities actually need. And we as a humanitarian sector have a lot of lessons and where that goes well and also where that doesn't. And silos between development, humanitarian and peace sectors have resulted in overlaps and gaps of funding at community level. And this rigidity in certain mandates means that sometimes activities that are very necessary fall between these silos. So in relation to any kind of funding mechanism, fund that will be developed, it is, I think, particularly important to make sure it remains flexible and it avoids rigidity. Currently, there's a lot of focus in seeing what are the gaps in the landscape of funding solutions that are out there and looking at this from a global level. But what's really important, and also kind of in our experience as humanitarians, is, okay, but what does this landscape, what does this mosaic actually look like in country level, and where are the gaps there? Because some pieces that are available at the global level are just simply not there at country level. Some countries will be in a situation where there is a humanitarian response plan, others will not. So I think it's very important that a fund or a funding arrangement, but a fund, should be developed that crosses the spectrum of loss and damage, and at least that all of these different elements of loss and damage will be covered in any response to loss and damage. And finally, I think this is very important to put these communities at the heart of what is being done in the development of this fund. Because ultimately, if it doesn't work for them, the fund is not successful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and really appreciate the wrap-up of a bit of a humanitarian perspective, recognizing, as I think you actually said right at the beginning, that humanitarians are not all the same, and we all have very many different views. I'd now really like to turn to a party perspective, and I'm really grateful that we have two colleagues in the room. If I can actually invite you to come up to the panel. I think we have a seat on either end, if you don't mind. So I just note that the Santiago Network conversations are on, so I'm really, really happy that we still managed to convince you to come and join us. So thank you so much for that. We have with us our colleagues Mikai Robertson, who's the Senior Advisor for AOSIS, Association of Small Island States, which is fantastic because one thing clearly missing from our panel was actually the perspective of small island developing states. So really important to hear that perspective, recognizing we as humanitarians may not have as much expertise and experience in some of these contexts. So really happy to have you here with us. And also Jens Fugel, who's the Chief Advisor for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for Denmark. And both of our colleagues have been the ones in the loss and damage negotiations. And I've also heard some very compelling explanations, including last year here in Bonn from Mikai around some of the real challenges in terms of both adaptation and loss and damage action. So I'd be really interested to hear from both of you, maybe first of all to Mikai. What are your expectations from this event this week and the Glasgow Dialogue? You know, and it would be great to hear some of your reflections on the discussion, the ongoing discussions on loss and damage, but also thinking about what you've just heard. What do you see as some of the role, but also the limits of humanitarian action, and how can we be working with others in this field to ensure a real comprehensive response to losses and damages? Over to you.
No, thank you, and good day to colleagues. The Glasgow Dialogue obviously has a very interesting history from a negotiation perspective. However, as it fits into the current structure of us finalizing the loss and damage and operationalizing the loss and damage funding arrangements, I think that this is a clear example of why it's important to integrate the findings of the loss and damage, the Glasgow Dialogue into the TC process. So it's to make sure to use what everyone is saying, coordination, complementarity, and bringing those messages from this room, and hopefully we'll hear interventions in the breakout groups from all of these participants in the Glasgow Dialogue tomorrow and the days after, so that we can learn from those lessons from this sector that has a very rich and long history. From my understanding, going back all the way to the Geneva Conventions and probably further behind that. So that's the Glasgow Dialogue, and then it feeds back into the TC process. And I look forward, as being a part of the TC process, to unpack a couple of things there, which kind of leads me then to a couple of thoughts as well that I had on the presentations. And I think one thing that I want to maybe spend a sentence on is preventative and prevention. And I think it's really good to see how the humanitarian sector interacts with adaptation, right? We've already established a response type of sorts in the context of adaptation. And I think that it's quite important that we look at that space and see how it fits into the context of the global goal on adaptation, all of those discussions there. Because that part of the equation of the different gaps that was highlighted by the very, very great presentation that you made fits into that mold. So I guess as well, the negotiation history of loss and damage, there has been, quite frankly, the intentional blurring of lines in the context of the adaptation space and the response space. So just to highlight, because I know that there were a couple of panelists that I guess that may have thought of it potentially being opposing, but I don't think at all it's opposing to one another. And I think it is very important that we close that adaptation gap. However, it does not solve the issue of the residual loss and damage that one will face, and the locked-in loss and damage based on emissions from that perspective. So even though the anticipatory action, the preventative measures are very important, we do see a clear gap in the currents of governing loss, actual loss. And it's not to say that, as I said, that the preventative parts are not important, but we do need to have a frank discussion as a global community on how we deal with loss. And one clear example on that is on human mobility. There is no system. If you're looking at the science and what is projected in the context of the loss of your territory, as well as the loss of your ability and your agency, and then you trying to figure out where's your new place in the world. Could you imagine, sadly, where we're going, with the current trajectory of 3 degrees and what the IPCC is saying in the losses of territory? How do we solve that on a global system perspective? And noting that the refugee side of things, of this space, it has been looking at it at piecemeal sort of conflicts as they happen, right? But this is systemic. This is climate change happening all at once, rapidly. And we have not, as a global community, started to think about a collective way to go forward and deal with that. And that, to me, is where I see, for example, this space of loss and damage, it's a bit more enhanced than what is currently right now, which is piecemeal linked to the appeals structure, etc. Next is the reasoning behind of humanitarian assistance, and at least from my layperson's understanding, it's altruism, right? It's based in our collective humanity that if someone has fallen down, right, you try your best to assist them, which is really good, and the international community does that. However, I think that just kind of diverting a bit from maybe the discussions on we repackage things, which we do, but I think in the context of climate change, loss and damage, there's certain underpinning principles that are different than the humanitarian system and how it was built out of. And it is linked to this sense of justice, especially from the context of the constituency that I represent, that has a disproportionate burden, especially to the share that we contributed to the problem. Which then, to kind of refocus, and I think we discussed on additionality, which I was happy to see, but it relates to this whole concept of the nexus. And the nexus it's a really nice word. It's a buzzword, but let's kind of begin to unpack that, because I think that the nexus is needed, but there's 2 levels to thinking about it. So the nexus is needed at the implementation level, absolutely. So your development finance, your humanitarian finance, and your climate finance needs to all work together in lockstep. So figuring out systems of that, I'll quickly just mention at the last part, but I have some questions on that. But just to note that that's on an implementation level. However, because of the concept that I was talking about in relation to justice and sort of responsibility, the second level where the nexus won't work is the matter of accountability in line with the responsibility. And so it's something that we have to think about in those who do create huge issues for us and have a large share in the problem. And mind you, it goes beyond country constructs, and it goes into industries, right? It goes into the private sector, and how they are enabling the issues there, and what is their duty of paying it forward in the context of assisting us with this additional burden. Because but for climate change, we would not have been engaging in discussion on loss and damage. So I just wanted to highlight that the nexus is at an implementation level, but an accountability level, we do need to have a discussion and make sure that there's sort of clear delineations as best as you can from that perspective. And then the second to last thing I'd highlight is on the gaps, and you alluded to them in the humanitarian space, and I know that on culture, on cultural heritage, on ecosystems, so nature's contributions to people. I know that the humanitarian space is focused on people, which is very important. But I think ecosystem services, nature's contribution to people, there's lessons to be learned from the climate space and maybe an environmental space over to the humanitarian space of how they could potentially expand their scope as well, to look at these issues concurrently. So the last, I guess, the last few points that I'd want to highlight, because I don't want to take up too much of the time. But I'm really, what I was really interested to hear in today is how, linked to that discussion on the environment and on society and safeguards and then rapidness. A question to the humanitarian sector is that, is there a correlation potentially with the small amounts that are given to the humanitarian sector because of the fact that maybe the procedures are not as in detailed in the context of environmental, social safeguards, etc., because of the risk associated with, for example, giving huge amounts of money to this area, and sort of assessing that. Noting that all I'm saying is that's the issue of climate finance right now, is that when you throw huge money at a problem, sadly, there's a whole, but for good reason, there's a whole slew of safeguards that you would have to at least, you'd have to have a plan. But again, that's another clear issue of there's not any clear implementation sometimes of that. So you would have to hire a consultant to do a 200-page environmental impact assessment and management plan, and it's like a checkbox exercise. However, it takes so much time. But then is it being actually followed through? No, because is a community going to be able to read a 200-page document, right, of impacts and a management plan? No, it's geared towards, not even myself. I sometimes sit down and read it and I'm like, this is absolutely PhD level kind of high science thinking. So, it really, we do need to interact with the system, which, for example, the Green Climate Fund uses the system that the International Finance Corporation or the World Bank use for its environmental social safeguards. It's not fit for purpose for actually implementing on the ground with communities. So I'll stop there and hand it back over to you. Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And some really important points there in terms of some clear, really big, hard, systemic challenges ahead, including in particular what's going to happen in terms of loss of territory and people potentially one day needing to move. This whole issue around the implementation versus accountability and very different needs for that. And then this whole piece around how you balance speed and flexibility with risk and the size and of the amount of the need versus the size that can move quickly. And I think these are some really good and really challenging issues that we definitely need to work through together. But rather than hearing from me, I'd like to turn now to Jens and ask you actually the same question in terms of, first of all, if you have some thoughts on the panel and on what you see as some of the role and the limits of humanitarian action when it comes to working with others to collectively address loss and damage, and also how you see this fitting into the conversations this week ahead. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you very much. And first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this event and for organizing it. I think it's an extremely timely event. I think we are exactly sort of at a stage in this sort of process that was initiated in Sharm, where we need to get all those sort of experiences from the field and experiences from those organizations that are already working in this field really on the table. We have the Glasgow dialogues coming up, so in a sense I was thinking this was almost what I had hoped for that the Glasgow dialogue would be. So in a sense I would hope that many of you will participate also in the Glasgow dialogue and sort of bring all these discussions into the dialogue so we can really capture them in the process. I think from sort of the onset of this work, I represent sort of, I have Denmark and the Netherlands, we have a shared seat in the transitional committee, and I think sort of from the onset we have, or even before this work started, I think we have been sort of very staunch supporters of what I could sort of broadly call sort of the global humanitarian architecture and system. And I think it's important, as you said right in the beginning, and as many of you have sort of emphasized, it's not just sort of some organizations and the instruments they have. It's also that huge sort of network that extends well into the national level and community level, and has been developed and evolved over a long time, that actually allows that system to respond to many types of disasters and catastrophes, including climate, in a very sort of appropriate and rapid way. And I think that's a system that is there, and that we need really to build on and strengthen and expand in those areas where that is sort of the relevant response to the things we are talking about. And I think, as you have also sort of told me today, I think I've been sort of confirmed in what I thought before, that actually you do have the responses to quite a number of things, definitely not to all of them. That I think we need to consider, but you also pointed to some, I think, important gaps. I think one of the gaps you pointed to is this sort of coordination gap. I mean, coordination going between what is now the humanitarian space and sort of development, disaster risk reduction, and what we're discussing in this climate space, including related to loss and damage. I think that's something where there's really some work to be done, that we need also to take on in the work of the Transitional Committee, and think into our recommendations that comes out of this. And I think very importantly, as it was also mentioned by, I think it was from Malawi, but I mean that this also applies to the national level, that really sort of this bringing more coherence and coordination at the national level between these sort of different actors and perspectives is really, really, really key, and something we also need to think about in the work on operationalizing new funding mechanisms and a fund for loss and damage. Yeah, so yeah, I think just a lot of good ideas and comments. So I could almost sort of refer back to each of the presentations and just sort of wish for more of that. So I think, as I said in the beginning, I really hope that some of you will participate in the Glasgow dialogues and sort of, in a sense, bring these perspectives into the discussion, and also think about, in a sense, how this process that we now have under UNFCCC, how we can make some recommendations that also make sense from the perspective of the humanitarian actors and that are out there, and sort of ensures that we really connect with that in those parts where there is a strong connection, I think, and where there is something that we should really try to build on and enhance. Yeah, I think I'll stop here.
Thank you so much. That was excellent and did a great job, I think, of building on what Mackay said about the adaptation gap that needs to be filled. But even if it's filled, we have this massive issue coming at us on loss and damage. But also this idea of a coordination gap, I think, is really quite powerful. This idea of the difference between action and implementation. So there's an action gap, an implementation gap, an accountability gap. And maybe one of the things we're really talking about is a gap in ambition, where we really need to scale up the ambition to have the action we need on loss and damage. I'm afraid we probably don't have time for the questions now from the floor. I'm sorry, but I'm hoping there's a way we can collect them. I think a lot of the people on this panel you will see throughout the week, so please come and grab them now afterwards, grab them through the week, and then I'd just like to hand over to Zinta to very quickly close for us. And thank you all so much.
All right. Well, there's nothing much to say aside from thank you to all the panelists and for the moderator, and to very much look forward to continuing to engage with you in these conversations at the Glasgow Dialogue this week. So thank you very much, and have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you for yours.